Before I begin the lecture, I want to express my thanks and deep gratitude to Javier Portos, Gabriele Finaldi, Juan Carlos Sanchez Acosta, the General Director of the Prado, for so many kindnesses, as well as inviting me to come here today to speak to you. And I also want to welcome the students, my colleagues, and all friends here today to this superb conference and this absolutely spectacular exhibition. Secondly, I want to dedicate this lecture to the memory of my colleague and friend, Professor Dr. Alfonso E. Perez Sanchez, whom I first met here in the library of the Prado in the autumn of 1968. At that time, I was beginning my doctoral dissertation, which 3 years later would become the first catalogue raisonné of the paintings of Giuseppe de Ribera. Dr. Perez Sanchez, who was greatly interested in my work on Ribera, extended to me every kindness and assistance in my studies, and provided access to the archives and to the vast storage depot of this superlative collection at the Prado. Our correspondence continued over many decades. It is with both joy and sadness that we think of Alfonso Perez Sanchez and his tremendous contribution to Spanish and Italian painting of the Baroque age. Joy for his pioneering work, as well as his advanced level of research and innumerable publications, and sadness because he is not with us today to share his critical thinking on a topic which has challenged us for so many decades. Indeed, in the last 10 years, a tremendous amount of research on the early life of Giuseppe de Ribera, shown here in the 18th century engraving, has resulted in the discovery of new documents, the finding and attribution of many paintings, and a major reconsideration of the early years when Ribera was in Italy. First in Naples around 1608-09, then in Rome around 1609-10, to Parma around 1610-11, and then back to Rome from sometime by 1612 until his departure for Naples in the late spring of 1616. The basis for a reconstruction of the young Ribera in Italy comes from the biography written in Rome about 1614 to 1621 by the papal physician and connoisseur Giulio Mancini, sections of which I will read later in this lecture, and recently from the diligent research of a number of art historians, foremost Gianni Papi, Niccolo Spinosa, and Gabriele Finaldi. Since this series of lectures is meant as a course for university students, I want to address a few words directly to them and to say something about the state of Ribera scholarship when I began my own studies as a university student in the 1960s. Yes, I'm that old. At that time, no complete systematic catalog of Ribera's works had been written, and the most thorough studies were August Meyer's abbreviated one in German from 1908, and Elizabeth Duguay-Trapier's general biography in English from 1952. Few of the paintings by Ribera had been cleaned. Most were covered with overpaint, old restorations, and thick layers of amber-colored varnish. I show you, for example, the magnificent Saint Jerome and the Angel of Judgment from 1626, now at the Museo di Capodimonte in Naples. I took an image of the signature area just after I discovered it on this painting in 1963. You see the J for Giuseppe. That's the way it looked. Although I had seen the painting many times before, it was only then that the lights were just right for the signature to appear. I quickly sent a message to the offices of Dr. Raffaello Causa and Dr. Nicola Spinosa, who kindly came to the gallery. If you had difficulty seeing this signature, I have enhanced it somewhat digitally here, where you can see the J. This is the state of scholarship and of visibility of paintings back at that time. For the first two-thirds of the 20th century, the Capodimonte's Drunken Silenus from 1626 was the earliest known painting by the artist. With the first international exhibition of paintings by Giuseppe de Ribera held at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas in 1982, I show you an image of the Drunken Silenus when the painting was in Fort Worth. And then the huge monographic exhibitions held in Naples, Madrid, and New York in celebration of the 400th anniversary of the birth of the artist. The exhibitions were in 1991, 1992. Suddenly, almost all the major paintings by Ribera had been restored to their former beauty and grandeur. That is only 20 years ago, students. At last, we were able to study with much more assurance this painter who was one of the greatest artists of the 17th century. Of course, I'm prejudiced. Interest in his art and in the artist himself had fallen into the shadows, much like that of El Greco, Caravaggio, Vermeer, and so many others who are now recognized as among the finest and most famous artists in Western history. Following the Kimball exhibition, we anticipated that there would be a revival of interest in Ribera. Indeed, that did occur, and that revival is still going on, which is the reason why we are all here today. Giuseppe de Ribera was baptized in the town of Játiva, province of Valencia, Spain, on the 17th of February, 1591. And throughout his life, he would proudly proclaim his nationality on the many signatures of his paintings, such as this one on the early Roman period, Saint Jerome, from the Joey and Toby Tannenbaum collection at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Toronto, Canada, which is signed, as you perhaps can make out there, Josephus Ribera, Valentinus Civitatis Setibus, Hispanus me fecit. Giuseppe Ribera from Valencia, the town of Játiva, a Spaniard, I made this. Curiously, for an artist of such significance during the 17th century, nothing is known with certainty about Ribera's early artistic development, with whom he might have studied, how he developed his personal style and technique, and even when and by route he traveled from Spain to Italy. With the exception of a growing number of archival documents from Parma and a greater number from a few years in Rome, all of the earlier biographical materials remain unresolved. Clues for his artistic career lie in a body of works that have been proposed in a brilliant reconstruction by Gianni Papi, and I say bravo, Gianni Papi, as painted by the young Ribera in Rome. Yet even this growing number of paintings poses a problem, especially in the chronology, because of the similarity to the works of many other young artists active in Rome at the same time, each vying for patrons and commissions. In 1629, Velázquez traveled to Italy by way of Genoa. As you can see here, the upper arrow, up to Genoa, and then overland, eventually arriving in Rome and finally Naples, from where he sailed back to Spain. Ribera, too, could have sailed to Genoa and then proceeded on to Naples, Or, which I think is more likely, he sailed directly to Naples and began his early artistic life in that Spanish-controlled city. Putting together the biographical references, Professor José Melicua of the University of Barcelona, one of our most distinguished scholars of Spanish art, proposed that Ribera journeyed to Italy close to 1608-1609, suggesting that first he was briefly in Naples. At that time, the young Ribera would have had the opportunity to acquaint himself with the local artist, to see paintings by Caravaggio, and I think even to have met Caravaggio himself, who had returned to Naples in October of 1609. It all depends when Ribera was there and when he left to go to Rome. In Naples, Ribera certainly would have looked at the paintings produced there by Caravaggio in 1607. The instantly famous Flagellation of Christ for the Church of San Domenico Maggiore, and the spectacular major altarpiece, the Seven Works of Mercy, for the Church of the Piemonte della Misericordia, commissioned by this organization of pious, socially minded men, and illustrating their various forms of charitable endeavors for the poor people of Naples. How impressed Ribera must have been with these works, which were the most modern, dramatic, and extraordinary paintings to be seen. Then Ribera traveled to Rome, where an enterprising young painter would have stopped, especially in these dynamic years of the new century, and probably been employed, as most others with artistic ambitions, in a workshop at a daily wage, as described in the biography written by Giulio Mancini. In that way, he would already have made his contacts in Rome, would have had time to produce works worthy of attention, and then could have set out for the northern part of Italy, to Parma and Lombardy, to learn, as it were, the origins of Caravaggio, and to see perhaps firsthand the great works in such cities as Florence, Milan, Bologna. What would Ribera have looked at in Rome? I say looked at, not as a casual tourist, but as an eager and enterprising young, basically untried artist, checking out the most up-to-date works, which he would need to surpass if he were to attract the attention of important patrons. The important word here is surpass, do better than. What was his competition, and who were his competitors in this art market? First, he would need to compete with Caravaggio, Annibale Carracci, and Guido Reni, and soon with the great wave of artists called the Caravaggisti. Probably a first stop would have been to the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi. So here is Rome, and there is San Luigi dei Francesi, home to the French community in Rome, made famous by Caravaggio's first public commission with the paintings in the Cantarelli Chapel around 1600, perhaps just less than a decade before Ribera's arrival in the Eternal City, and already a goal for young artists from many parts of Europe. There he would have seen the three great paintings by Caravaggio illustrating episodes from the life of St. Matthew, the patron saint or the benefactor of the chapel, Cardinal Mathieu Cantrell. On the left wall is the Calling of St. Matthew, a critical painting for narrative historical subjects of which Ribera would become a major proponent. And on the right wall is the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, which includes Caravaggio's self-portrait, as I indicate there, and there in detail on the left. And over the altar, the second version of the Inspiration of St. Matthew. The first version of this subject may never have made it to the altar, because it was purchased by the vastly wealthy collectors, the brothers Giustiniani, the Marchese Vincenzo, and his elder brother, the Cardinal Benedetto, who had inherited the family palace diagonally across the street from this same church of San Luigi dei Francesi on the death of their father in 1600. There had circulated a story, apocryphal or not, that Caravaggio's commissioners at the church disliked this first version because it showed St. Matthew as an illiterate old peasant, swinging his dirty bare foot over the altar, as shown here in the image superimposed in the place for which it was originally intended. Supposedly, the Giustiniani generously offered to buy the painting from the church, resulting in Caravaggio being asked to paint another version. The story and the surrounding gossip surely were actively repeated when Ribera was in Rome, and because the Giustiniani provided room and board for young artists in their great palazzo, and Caravaggio had been one of them, Ribera could easily have gained access to this painting and the Giustiniani collection, and even to the collectors themselves, who would eventually have a dozen of his paintings. In fact, I think that Ribera remembered this painting for his own St. Matthew, painted a few years later when he was in Naples. Also, Ribera would have visited the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo, where in 1601, Caravaggio had his second public commission, 2 paintings for the Cerasi Chapel, this time in competition with Rome's greatest painter, Annibale Carracci. This is a small chapel visually filled with 3 paintings. Over the altar is Annibale Carracci's Assumption of the Virgin, where Mary seems to be jet-propelled as she is carried aloft by angels, and below her, on the left, is St. Peter, about to fall out of the painting onto the altar, and to the right, St. Paul, who is falling back into the picture space of the painting. The painting on the left, of course, is Caravaggio's famous Crucifixion of St. Peter, and the one on the right is his conversion of St. Paul. These paintings are examples of the 2 dominant styles at the beginning of the new century, styles which Ribera would need to master, if not surpass. Around 1600-1601, Annibale Carracci and Caravaggio were the 2 most famous artists in Rome. At least I think so. The first well-established, Annibale, the other rapidly gaining recognition as a powerful new force among the younger artists. The competitive spirit between these 2 painters must have been fierce. Annibale's painting immediately involves us with the internal energies of the design. The Assumption of the Virgin also is the unifying spirit here and the force for the compositional and visual power generated by all of the paintings in this chapel. It serves as the link to Caravaggio's paintings on the lateral walls, which continue with critical events in the lives of the 2 principal saints found in the lower corners of the Assumption. These compositions, with their very real and dynamic figures, are the sources for Ribera's further understanding of space, both within the composition and outward to the viewer's space, as well as the interaction between the 2. From them, Ribera could also learn how to present figures as real, living individuals engaged in the events taking place, an historic narrative, and not just illustrations for an historic or biblical episode. These are real, dynamic figures interacting with us. Ribera continued on to Parma as recently suggested by Michele Cordaro and Gabriele Finaldi, under the protection of the nobleman Mario Farnese, who was a patron of the arts and frequently traveled between his family residences in Rome and Parma. He was on the lookout for promising young artists and may have taken Ribera with him to Parma in 1610. On the 11th of June in the following year, that is 1611, Ribera received payment from the Church of San Prospero in Parma for an altarpiece of St. Martin sharing his cloak with a beggar. In Parma, he also painted an Assumption of the Virgin with Saints Cosmas and Damian for the Benedictine convent church of San Quentino. In the early 19th century, Napoleonic forces removed these paintings from the churches in Parma and took them back to France. Their current locations are not known. However, the composition of the St. Martin is known through a painting such as this copy on the left and an etching of it. In Considerazione sulla pittura, written just a few years later in Rome, that is, once again, between 1614 and 1621, Giulio Mancini says, "It cannot, and not to be denied, that Giuseppe Ribera of Valencia, commonly called Lo Spagnoletto, is the most naturally gifted artist to have appeared in many years." That's high praise. For while still quite young, having journeyed through Lombardy to see the works of those able men, and finding himself in Parma, he aroused the jealous fear of those who serve His Highness. Now that would be Duke Ranuccio Maria I Farnese, who is a cousin of Mario. That coming to the notice of that prince, he might be taken into the latter's service, causing them, the locals, to lose their positions. For that reason, they forced him to leave. And having come to Rome, he worked for a daily wage for those who have workshops and sell paintings for the labors of similar young men. With this opportunity, comporting himself well, he made his talents known and came into a great reputation and a very great profit. That says something about Ribera in Rome. Arriving back in Rome, fresh with successes in Parma, and as an established and confident artist, Ribera would have been ready to compete with the other young artists who were flocking to the Eternal City. The first years in Rome, he lived at various places until moving to the Via Margutta. And I walked the length of the Via Margutta last week, hoping that Ribera's spirit would inspire me, where he is documented as residing in 1615 and 1616. These years of Ribera's second stay in Rome, that is around 1612 to 1616, are the focus of our attention today. What did Ribera see, and who did he believe were his competitors for fame and glory? Certainly, he recognized that his paintings needed to compete with those of Annibale Carracci and Caravaggio. And he also knew that suddenly there was this growing number of painters arriving in Rome who were vying for the same recognition of the very same patrons. With Caravaggio's abrupt departure from Rome in 1606 and Annibale's death in 1609, the most important artist in the papal city was Guido Reni, who had studied at the Carracci's famous art academy in Bologna before coming to Rome in 1601. Almost immediately, Guido developed his independent career, accepting commissions from important patrons. This was also the moment Annibale and Caravaggio finished their paintings for the Chirazi Chapel. So there is Guido, and here again is the Chirazi Chapel. Guido must have recognized the phenomenal spatial dynamics these three compositions gave to the small chapel, and it was he who would generate the design formulas that ushered in the new era, combining elements from both of his two great predecessors. Taking principal figures from the Cherazi Chapel paintings, Guido reconfigured them in his own original way. His crucifixion of St. Peter, here on the left, now in the Pinacoteca Vaticana from 1604 to 1605, is a direct response to Caravaggio's painting of the same subject, but adding a strong classical harmony and symmetry to Caravaggio's rather compressed or squeezed design and strong diagonal thrust. Guido's crucifixion of St. Peter, along with his Saints Peter and Paul, now in the Brera in Milano, from 1605 to 1606, set the stage for this new style. These paintings depend on the classical idiom, that is, with designs of compositional balanced and idealized sculptural figures, as promulgated by Annibale Carracci, but they also have a greater intensity of robust figures caught in the intense chiaroscuro of the dramatic lighting learned from Caravaggio. They served the young Ribera as examples of the newest wave of painting in Rome, and also as works with which he had again to compete. This relationship becomes immediately apparent when Guido's Saints Peter and Paul is compared with the same subject by Ribera in the painting now in Strasbourg, dated to about 1614, 1615, that is from Ribera's second stay in Rome. In fact, it would seem from so many parallels in subjects throughout their professional lives that Ribera and Guido maintained a competitive spirit during their long careers. I show you, for example, first, St. Jerome and the Angel by both artists. Ribera, Guido, the intensity of Ribera's painting, the classical demeanor and coloristic beauty of Guido's. Then Guido's Apollo flaying Marsyas from the early 1620s, and Ribera's Prometheus from probably a few years later, and then Ribera's Apollo flaying Marsyas from 1637. And finally, the Baptism of Christ, wonderfully painted by both artists, but in their own mistakable styles. They always seem to be responding, one artist to the other, and I find that a fascinating topic in itself. Ribera is documented as living in Rome in 1612. And in the following year, on the 24th of October, 1613, he was received in the prestigious Society of Artists, the Accademia di San Luca, which fact he added to his signature on the painting of Saints Peter and Paul. And you can read it there on the left. 2 days later, he was invited to attend a meeting to discuss the Church of the Accademia. Subsequently, 6 months later, on the 6th of April, 1614, Ribera, along with two prominent and well-established painters, Guido Reni and Anteveduta Grammatica, each pledged the grand sum of 100 scudi towards the project of the Accademia's church, a great amount of money and exceeding what many artists were paid for their works. Mancini, for example, tells us that a, quote, good artist could earn 3 to 6 scudi a day. Therefore, the 100 scudi would amount to about a month's earnings. More than a measure of Ribera's actual success, This pledge may indicate Ribera's competitive spirit, his driving need to place himself above other artists and to associate himself with the best-known painters in town. He was in good company. Guido Reni was the most sought-after artist in Rome, and Grammatica may have been positioning himself in the administration of the Accademia, where he would become head briefly in 1624. Ribera's life in Rome is further recorded by Mancini, who said, "In Rome, Ribera became much admired by Signor Guido, who thought a good deal of his determination and his colorito, his handling of the paint, which for the most part follows the path of Caravaggio, but is more experimental and bolder." Now those are strong, powerful words. Here is Ribera, who follows the path of Caravaggio, but is more experimental and bolder. Mancini tells us that Ribera had a colorful bohemian life in Rome. We now have him documented as moving about from one rental property to another and being a fast talker with his promises for paintings. There is something of the braggart about this image, and one wonders if Ribera did not try to adopt a persona similar to the one left behind by Caravaggio. His motivation would be to demonstrate to his patrons his own bold new way of capturing the reality of a figure or the immediacy of a narrative. Novelty was the key to success. It still is. Novelty was the key to success, and Ribera rapidly became known as an artist to be reckoned with. As a note of distinction, and I think as a matter of pride, Ribera's nickname, Lo Spagnoletto, caused him to stand apart from the others. The painting that served for the critical reevaluation of Ribera's career in Rome during this time is the Saint Jerome from Toronto, Canada. Here Ribera presents the old saint with graphic reality, appearing before us as an actual person. His sun-tanned, leathery skin and sinewy body and arms indicate the arduous life the saint has led. And now he is concentrating on his last great task, the translation of books of the Bible into Latin, called the Vulgate, used to this day by Catholic Christianity. Saint Jerome was also a favorite saint of the Counter-Reformation because of his great efforts to reform the early Christian church. Ribera placed the figure of Saint Jerome on the opposite side of a table from the viewer. The picture space becomes the new reality, and the viewer an active participant in a dialogue with the saint. This is Ribera's dynamic and original visual statement. His figures are real, alive, and accessible to us. In this way, the drama of the subject does not exist as being isolated in some other realm. Rather, it is present and part of the actual sensate world, the senses, the sensate world in which we live. We can suppose that Ribera was aware of the painting of Saint Jerome by Caravaggio from about 1606. Then as now in the famous Borghese collection in Rome. There is a quiet stillness about Caravaggio's beautiful composition, but it is a staged representation with a careful calculation given to the various parts and passages of it. Caravaggio seems to move a lens across the figure and the long arm that reaches out across the desk, bringing some areas into critical detail, while others recede into soft focus. The psychological state of Caravaggio's figure is deeply felt, but without a potential for change or interaction. Saint Jerome here remains lost in his own world, remote from the viewer. Ribera's figure seems alert and spontaneous, filled with a raw energy, or as Mancini says, bolder than the works of Caravaggio, and perhaps more experimental. Ribera's sense of design and his handling of figure, light, and space are so very different from those of Caravaggio. Part of Ribera's forceful presentation is caused by the rather careless piles of books and papers in front of us, in contrast to Caravaggio's painting, where each object has a still life quality, lovingly studied and carefully revealed by the subtle placement of the illumination, and an organization ensuring a harmony and balance of the objects, producing a stasis to the entire composition, a quiet composition. We know that when Caravaggio came to Rome, he was recognized for the quality of his still life paintings, and such elements in his works give ample testimony to his phenomenal skill in that genre. In fact, his still lifes, to me, often seem to compete with the figures. Prior to the discovery of the painting of Saint Jerome, the earliest known figures by the young Ribera were the 5 paintings of a series, each canvas with an individual figure representing one of the 5 senses. As Giulio Mancini says, Ribera made many things here in Rome, and in particular for, and there's a gap in the text. The name is omitted, but probably is Pietro Cuthida, agent in Rome for the Spanish king, as suggested by Gianni Papi, the Spaniard, who has 5 very beautiful figures representing the 5 senses: a Christ deposed, Cristo deposto, and others which in turn are things of most exquisite beauty. Because of Mancini's biography, the paintings of the 5 senses became the starting point for the reconstruction in the 1960s of Ribera's early career in Rome. For each of the paintings in this series, Ribera placed a distinct model, probably found from among his acquaintances on the streets of Rome, behind a table in which are items associated with the subject, varying the use of his paint in color and texture, as well as the naturalistic details that inform the individuality of these figures. The sense of taste clearly participates in the same aesthetic and interpretation as Annibalé's famous Bean Eater, painted in Bologna around 1583 to 1584. One is also reminded of early Roman works by Caravaggio showing half-length figures such as the Sick Bacchus from around 1595-96 in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, and the Lute Player from 1598-1599, now in the Hermitage, St. Petersburg, but painted for the Giustiniani. Ribera's 5 senses have a greater atmospheric reality and natural physical presence than these paintings by Caravaggio, at least that's my opinion, that appear to be staged in dramatic set pieces. It is such works as these that indicate how Ribera responded to what must have been recognized as his competition. The figure in the sense of sight holds a Galilean telescope. Here are 2 telescopes made by Galileo, now in the Science Museum in Florence. I wonder if it was Monsignor Agucchi, whom we see here in a painting by his friend Annibale Carracci, who provided an actual telescope for Ribera's painting. The Monsignor, closely connected to the papal court, was the wise and influential friend of artists and intellectuals in Rome. He may have been the source for Ribera's invention of this mode of representation of the 5 senses, and perhaps the telescope in Ribera's sense of sight is the one used by Agucci in his own studies of the stars, prompted by his friend Galileo, the great astronomer himself. Indeed, if Ribera were well known to Agucci, he must already have reached a prominence among the young artists and the influential patrons in Rome. In the last 10 years, many paintings have been attributed to Ribera, all having been painted during his 2 stays in Rome, the first from sometime in 1609 to 1610, and the second from about 1612 to 1616, as I have already said. Indeed, Giulio Mancini tells us that Ribera gained a very great reputation, remember, and we know of his extravagant pledge to the Accademia di San Luca. Attributions of these paintings during this period is a most complex process because of the many young painters, artists who suddenly appeared in Rome, undoubtedly drawn to the Eternal City by the wildfire spread of the exciting news of the changes that had occurred in the painting at the beginning of the new century, especially the works of Caravaggio. In addition to Bartolomeo Manfredi, who was active in Rome from about 1610 until his death in 1620 or 1621, many Dutch artists were in Rome as well. Ter Horten was probably in Rome from late 1607 or early 1608 until his return to Utrecht about 1615. But currently, none of his Italian period works are known, although I have recently heard about 2 paintings which may be from 1612 to 1614, paintings that we now must watch for. Dirk van Baburen arrived in Italy about 1612 and soon received a commission for a martyrdom of St. Lawrence in a church in Parma, a painting which is now lost. He returned to Utrecht in 1620. Gerrit van Honthorst, who had arrived in Rome about 1613, but is not documented there until 1616, seems to have been rapidly taken up by the avid collectors, the brothers Giustiniani, who became his patrons. In fact, Honthorst was one of the painters who lived in the Palazzo Giustiniani. He returned to Utrecht in 1620 along with Baburen. His known Roman works are unlike those by Ribera, and they fall into the years immediately after Ribera's departure for Naples in 1616. Another of the northern artists, David de Haen, a close associate of Baburen, died in the Palazzo Giustiniani in 1622. All of these artists then work in a style that was derived from their various responses to the revolutionary paintings of Caravaggio. These were the young artists with whom Ribera would be linked by the Marchese Giustiniani. The competition among them for patrons and commissions must have caused a tense, if not an electric spirit of rivalry and intrigue. Sometime perhaps in the early 1630s, Vincenzo Giustiniani wrote a letter to his friend Teodoro Armaiden, in which he sets up certain categories concerning the methods of painting and ranking of painters. His 11th method is for those artists who paint directly from natural objects before one's eyes. Giustiniani warns us that it is not enough, quote, to make a mere reproduction, end quote. Rather, he says, it is necessary that the work be well designed, with fine, well-proportioned contours. It must have pleasing and appropriate coloring, which comes from the experience of knowing how to handle color. Colorito, that word that Mancini used, and almost from instinct, and as a gift granted to few. In these groups, the Marchese includes Rubens, Giuseppe the Spaniard, Honthorst, Terbruggen, Beburen, and others like them. He adds that, quote, most of them were Flemish. He did not distinguish between Dutch and Flemish, but were active in Rome and had a good sense of color. In our time, continued the Marchese, this is the way that Caravaggio, the Carracci, Guido Reni, and other world-famous painters of the highest rank painted. Giustiniani's selection of Ribera, the young Ribera, to include with the Flemish and Dutch artists, and with Rubens, who followed the 11th method of painting, confirms the important reputation Ribera had gained in Rome and indicates Giustiniani's own astute powers as a connoisseur. Indeed, Giustiniani had been acquiring paintings from all of these young artists. It is in this context that Ribera made his, quote, great reputation and very great profit as recorded by Mancini. In fact, ultimately, 13 canvases by Lo Spagnoletto were listed among the over 600 paintings in the 1638 post-mortem inventory of the collection of the Marchese Giustiniani. Ribera could easily have known personally all of these second-generation artists. Caravaggesque artists, certainly, and Ribera must have studied their works with great care. They are the artists Ribera recognized as his new competitors. Because Ribera is an artist whose star faded as the century waned, and because he too understood and used Caravaggio's new and revolutionary realism in his own particular way, it is only recently that art historians have come to distinguish his paintings from those of the other Caravaggisti, and to recognize Ribera's important position and perhaps even his dominance in Rome during these years from 1612 to 1616. Also, Ribera's Roman works are difficult to date, since there are no documents to establish any public commissions. Because of Gianni Papi's reconstruction of Ribera's early Roman period, we can analyze the critical development of his artistic powers during the years. A group of works formerly given to the anonymous Master of the Judgment of Solomon, such as this painting of the Judgment of Solomon from Ribera's first day in Rome, that is around 1610, before he went to Parma, is the most complex design of the earliest of these paintings. Here Ribera presents his subject in a compressed space, much like that of relief sculpture, and he has pushed almost all of the activity into the middle ground, with the figures somewhat awkwardly in different scales. After his return to Rome from Parma, he painted the Jesus among the doctors in the temple, now dated to about 1613. This is a multi-figured work with much more activity. However, this remains a youthful work, and Ribera has not yet learned the art of integrating the actions of the many figures into a cohesive historical narrative, but rather has scattered them around the composition in a somewhat haphazard manner. Significantly, this painting was in the Giustiniani collection. It is around these paintings that others are grouped, such as the single figure of St. Thomas and that of St. Bartholomew with his symbolic knife. The early paintings by Ribera serve as examples of the hugely problematic situation with attribution to other works to this complex and large number of painters working in Rome during this vital second decade of the century. What is of great importance here is how much Ribera seems to be at the center of this artistic production. Let us look at the works which Ribera would have given his critical attention. A major painting by Dirk van Baburen, Christ washing the feet of the apostles, from about 1615 to 1617, is one of the best large-scale examples to illustrate what one of the enterprising second-generation Caravaggesque artists was painting in Rome, especially among the Flemings, although he's Dutch, with whom Ribera was grouped by the Marchese. This early work also comes from the famous Giustiniani collection, supports the association of Ribera with these young artists. Baburen's painting is visually compelling and serves as a link to additional paintings now attributed to the young Ribera. Baburen's Christ washing the feet of the apostles and Manfredi's tribute money from around 1615 are both large paintings with full-scale figures. It is such multi-figured compositions as these that set the standards for painting in Rome during these years. The pivotal and perhaps the most critical painting from the Roman years of Ribera is the large-scale Raising of Lazarus, bought in 2001 for the Prado, which I show you juxtaposed with the paintings by Baburen and Manfredi. When compared with them, it is Ribera's Lazarus from around 1615 that demonstrates the greatest sense of concentration on a critically focused design, incorporating the action of the figures and the narration that is taking place, and also a sureness to the drawing and to the resolution of each of the figures, leading to a more sharply detailed visual reality. The other two paintings depend upon a dark atmosphere and a stage-set presentation of the subjects. Ribera zooms us right into the critical moment of this miracle of resurrection, thereby integrating the action of his entire composition. Mancini comes close to Ribera's concentrated narrative, and indeed he is Ribera's chief rival for prominence in this decade. A question remains: how did Ribera move from a work such as the Jesus among the doctors in the temple to this masterpiece of the Raising of Lazarus? I have no answers, because there, to me, are as yet no paintings to fill the gap. But what I expect happened is that Ribera recognized the forcefulness of Manfredi's large dynamic figures and combined such figures in his own carefully constructed narrative designs. An even earlier painting by Manfredi, this Christ driving the merchants from the temple, placed by Nicole Jarge and others to about 1610-12, a painting which is closely in the orbit of Caravaggio, may well be one of the sources of such inspiration for Ribera. It has a critical focus of design, with the powerful action of Christ driving the other figures forcefully across the picture space. It is from such a painting that Ribera has learned about the resolution of action and how to capture the dramatic moment of his subjects. The result is his early masterpiece, The Raising of Lazarus, which signifies to me that Ribera has become the artistic leader of these young painters, and it is his work to which the others needed to turn for inspiration. For example, to further establish this comparison between Ribera and the young international artists in Rome is Ribera's denial of St. Peter, which I believe is from around 1615. The subject is an important one for all of these artists and was repeated by them several times in various configurations. The denial of St. Peter was attributed to Ribera only in the last decade, after years of debate of its authorship. In it, we can see how Ribera has used the same figure of the turban maid, which he had placed in the center of the composition of the earlier Jesus among the doctors in the temple. In fact, we find her also without the cloth headdress as the kneeling figure in the Judgment of Solomon, that the mother there in the foreground. The denial of St. Peter is a powerful work and is another linchpin to an examination of paintings by Manfredi. This composition owes a tremendous debt to Caravaggio's late work of the same subject, circa 1609, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. But Ribera has turned the design into an imposing horizontal format, combining the denial with the gambling soldiers, and producing an impressive work with forceful figures carefully positioned to narrate the story with clarity across the picture space. Ribera has also textured his paint to approximate the natural patterns of flesh and fabrics, thereby heightening the reality of the event before us. Remember that Mancini said that Ribera's use of paint was bolder and more experimental than Caravaggio's, and that Guido Reni admired his handling of paint. We also know how Ribera has stressed the importance of gestures. Always look at gestures with Ribera, the body language, the hands. From the hands of St. Peter clasped and pointing to his chest, to the accusing maid and the pointing man in the center of the painting, who serves as the link to the soldiers at the left. Key figures that have been given the strongest lighting. The standing man at the left and the soldiers around the table, the heads of both men at the center, the maid and St. Peter. What we have here is a narrative that considers cause and effect. Because Peter has denied Christ, his action causes the maid to point to him and also to look sharply to our left in profile toward the soldiers. The man in the center pointing to St. Peter further indicates that St. Peter is the cause of this activity, and he directs our focus on the gambling soldiers. Here the maid and the intermediary figure pointing to her and St. Peter are fundamental to our interpretation of the narrative. In this way, the denial of St. Peter shares a compositional power and direction with the raising of Lazarus, and indicates to me that they are both from near the same time. This is by Ribera, and it demonstrates his skills in organizing his composition and the figures in a powerful, cohesive unity. Another painting of the denial of St. Peter, this one by Manfredi, is dated to about 1620, which would have been shortly before his death and 4 years after Ribera's removal to Naples. Here Manfredi has combined the same two subjects, but has given the greater emphasis to the gambling soldiers here. St. Peter's denial, up here, seems to be an incidental episode in the narrative, thereby losing the consequential cause and effect of Ribera's earlier and carefully constructed work. Perhaps it is now Ribera to whom all other painters took notice. Ribera had achieved a great level of success with his masterpieces from around 1615, and such recognition was surely merited. As we have now seen, the young Ribera, arriving in Naples around 1689, would have plunged into a vibrant artistic atmosphere totally unlike what he had experienced in Spain. Immediately, he would have discovered that what he needed to do in order to be a successful artist. An artist who could gain a very great reputation and become more famous, perhaps, than all others. Such ambitious goals are not casually or easily won. Although Naples had many fine artists, until the arrival of Caravaggio there in 1607, the local artists were still practicing a style more compatible to the previous century. If Caravaggio's art was so new, so bold, and so modern, it behooved Ribera to trace its source north to Rome. And to Rome, we know he went to learn more about Caravaggio's art and about the other artists who were working there. Chance, coupled with his great talent, keen intelligence, and hard work, took him to Parma and back to Rome, where he was then prepared to take on all other artists in a fierce competition for the patrons and the glory each of them sought. He knew his competition was Annibale Carracci and Caravaggio. Then it included Guido Reni, Manfredi, and Baburin. These were the painters in Rome he needed to surpass. The paintings of the Denial of St. Peter and the Raising of Lazarus are among the most phenomenal to me and great masterpieces of this decade. And they demonstrate that Ribera was not only a master rightfully taking the position as a major painter in Rome, but also a leader in defining the style of art for a new age. He came to Rome, he saw what was there, and he refined his artistic skills, satisfying the acquisitive needs of important collectors and setting the standard for his time. In hindsight, we know that this new style would not last long, and it would be replaced by a continuation of the classicism of the Carracci school and the new exuberance of the age of Pietro da Cortona and Bernini. Mancini describes Ribera's life and career in Rome, indicating that Ribera was rather loose with his promises to patrons and perhaps saw that his free-wheeling days in Rome needed of necessity to come to an end. He may even have recognized that the times were changing and he needed a new venue for his paintings. Mancini concludes his biography of Ribera with, quote, "Notwithstanding all this and his extravagant ways, he had a very great reputation. And what is a greater marvel, he turned aside with sweet words men that had a taste for painting, who were creditors of loans of money, with his chattering, words, and tricks, giving them hope of doing that for which they desired." But as time went by, disliking the work and leading a life in which he spent much more than he earned, he was forced and compelled by debt to leave Rome and to go to Naples. And we will hear about his career in Naples from Professor Dr. Nicola Spinoza. Muchas gracias.